right? So yeah, so there are so many smaller aspects of the framework that do come up, and often it is very tough to arrive at what is important and what is not with respect to competencies. I remember when there was one assignment that I was doing along with another colleague of mine, and we were trying to define mid-manager technical competencies for one particular company. So it was very specific, the assignment. For a manufacturing automobile ancillary company, mid-manager technical competencies. And unfortunately, neither am I an automobile expert nor am I an engineer. So it was really tough. And when we started the design process, started off as like a 1 month exercise, but we ended up spending 3 to 4 months, because what happens is when people talk about competencies, everybody gets into a projection mode. They want to share how tough it is, how complex those competencies are, and how critical they are for organization success. And they cite instances where they felt they achieved a lot, accomplished a lot because of the competencies they bring to the table. And it took us close to about 3.5, 4 months to kind of distill it into just a few competencies. So I can imagine, Aruna, when you're saying that, you know, we had a lot of doubts, especially when it comes to technical competencies, it is very tough. But that's where our smartness, our sharp acumen about competencies helps, right? So good. I am happy that you started the process, and I'll definitely look at the document and I'll come back to you with uh, feedback.
Thank you so much.
So we will move further on to the third module today, which is about leadership competency framework. And I'm sure all of you would have heard a lot about leadership competencies and how they are important. So in this chapter, we cover basically 3 leadership frameworks that we're going to discuss. One is the Barrel's leadership framework, second is Rubin's leadership framework, and third is the pyramid leadership competency framework. Now, while Barrel's is the one which is most often used in organizations, or rather in India, it is quite accepted to use the Barrel's leadership framework. You might not have heard it as Barrel as such. There are a lot of other books that have been written which uses a similar framework in different names. We want to, I don't want to get into which books and all right now, but yeah, the framework, the base foundation of it is the Barrel's leadership framework. The second one is the Rubin's leadership framework, which defines it in a slightly different way. And then, of course, you have the pyramid leadership competency framework. So we're going to discuss all of these today. So to start with, why is leadership competency framework important? Why is it necessary to have a leadership competency framework? Why can't we just make do with behavioral competencies or organization competencies or technical competencies? Why have a leadership framework? Anybody would want to answer that? Why is it important to have a leadership competency framework?
Ma'am, may I?
Yeah, please go ahead, Aruna.
Ma'am, as we all know that, when it comes to leaders can be at any level. When we talk about leaders can be at any level. But then it's the competencies that they come with influences the entire organization in terms of strategic planning or the business decisions that we talk about, or even as the leadership competencies become prominent at the topmost level, or I would say from middle management level, the prominence starts showing up. That's where the style of leadership and all that matters a lot. So keeping these aspects and as they're at the helm of affairs, I think leadership competency framework makes a huge difference to the organization.
Yes. So, adding on to what you're saying, Aruna, it's important that organizations define the leadership competencies very clearly. And the reason is the leadership that is expected in some companies is very, very different from the leadership that is expected in other organizations. Uh, it's like, I mean, if you look at it from a country perspective, today Russia and Ukraine are very good examples of how the leadership um, operates, right? And both are acceptable to their respective people, and they've identified certain traits as important for them, right? So in certain companies, you will find that leadership means aligning with multiple departments, making sure people agree to what you're saying, collaborating with other departments, arriving at decisions which are agreed upon. Whereas in other organizations, it's about decisive leadership, right? How many tough decisions did you take? And how did you drive those decisions? How did you make sure that everybody falls in line? It is not about aligning, it is about falling in line, right? So, there are multiple ways of leadership that happens, and um, uh, what what I often find is also that when we are assessing, because we are on the topic of development, assessment, development, center management, if we assess someone on some other leadership competencies which are useful for another organization and we assess them for our company, then it creates an issue. So that's why it's important to identify and create a leadership competency framework that works for our organization, right? So again, similarly, how do we do this? We have discussed this before also. We get into behavioral event interviews or competency based interviews and ask questions which are related to uh, how did you accomplish the biggest leadership goal that you've had in the past 1 year? What did you do? How did you drive the team? How did you get your work done? And when people talk about it and you see a common pattern emerging across multiple leaders in the organization, that's what you start sifting through and then analyzing and making inference. So important for us to understand that these frameworks exist in different forms in different organizations, and useful to know that how it can be looked at. So we are discussing only three. If you just do a Google search, you will find there are millions of leadership competency models, right? Very tough to actually sift through and identify which one you want to use. But mota moti, if you look at it at a very broad level, you will be able to classify them into these three only. Okay, so we're going to talk about these three today. So Peter F. Drucker very uh, uh, famously said this: one must lead oneself before being able to lead others, right? And this became a kind of like a anthem for many leadership analysts or leadership coaches, and they started talking about self leadership. Right. So I think Aruna also mentioned it just now about self leadership and how do you lead yourself. And that has become very, very common and popular now to talk about. And of course, uh, Pierce in 2007 again reiterated this. So, one thing that we need to remember is leadership competency framework must be looked at from a long-term perspective. So, whereas our technical competencies, behavioral competencies might be something that is more short or medium term by nature, and we keep renewing it or revising it every 6 months, the basic foundation of a leadership competency framework should be more a couple of years should be kept in mind, right? So you can't make a leadership competency framework which is useful for the next few months. You have to make a leadership competency framework which is applicable for multiple years. Um, some organizations look at it from a 3 to 5 year perspective, right? Tough to do that. Again, the reason is the changing scenario of the world. So couple of examples I think came up during the COVID time itself, right? So many changes. There were some companies which were managed to succeed because the leadership was very agile, very responsive. Some companies where the leadership was more bureaucratic by nature, wanted data to take decisions, didn't have any data to take decisions, kind of went through a very, very tough time, right? So there are different competencies within leadership that have started becoming more important now than before. But having said that, there is a lot of uh, uh, weight in looking back at past performance and also looking at the strategic imperatives of the organization before arriving at the leadership competency framework, right? So let's look at the Barrett's leadership framework first. Richard Barrett talked about different levels of leadership and the competencies that are related to each level, right? So the leadership profile talks about three levels of leadership competencies, which are defined as, sorry, leading self, leading others, leading organization or business or multiple teams. So he is actually defined the leadership in three levels, right? Now, of course, one can always refute this and say that why not four, or why not five, or why not two, right? But that's his framework. So we're going to go with that framework that he has given so that it helps us in bringing some kind of clarity to our thinking, right? So he looks at it from three angles: first level leaders, mid level leaders, and senior leaders. And we're going to talk about each one of them. So, first level of leadership competencies refer to the survival skills that become the focus of this level, right? So he said that no, you need to look at how do I manage to survive in today's environment, in today's context, and what competencies do I need to make sure that I execute well and I'm able to they say, right, survival of the fittest. How can I be the fittest or the best given that there are others around, right? So that's the perspective with which the first level leadership traits or competencies were identified by Barrett. So he actually defines this in a few categories. The first category of leadership, he said, should be visionary, right? So usually we associate visionary with senior level people. He said no, every leader in the organization, even the first level leaders, that means people who are responsible for execution of plans, execution of strategies, should also be visionary. But what does visionary mean in their context? In their context, it's about understanding and translating the strategy and objective of the organization into specific goals and targets, right? So that is what he said was visionary at the first level of leadership. I'd like to hear from all of you if you can think of an example of this. Let's look at, say, for example, a sales role in an organization and a regional sales manager who's responsible for executing sales targets, right? So, in your mind, what would visionary mean for this role? How will you define it? Visionary for the role of a regional sales manager. Anybody would want to answer that?
So, ma'am, it could be that the person who is a regional sales manager at the timing may aspire to become national or global manager, and he may have that vision, and he may find out the competencies required to reach at that level. I don't know whether I'm right or wrong.
Yeah. See, you were thinking in the right direction, Tanu. So, from a visionary angle, we are saying he has to translate the strategy and objective, right, into plans and targets. So, what will be the competency here? What will be the, if you had to just put it in a couple of words, 5 or 6 words, how will you define this for a regional sales manager?
Drive for results.
Absolutely, right? Driving results through teams, right? So understanding organizational long-term strategy and driving results through teams, right? So that is all that is required at this level, right? So visionary here is about not about creating a vision for his team. We are not talking about that. We're just talking about executing the vision at the ground level through teams, right? So because we're talking about the first level leaders. Okay. Then he talked about tactician. So Barrett said that every leader has to be a tactician. So what does tactician mean? For this level, tactician would mean ensuring results are achieved by planning work, defining key roles and responsibilities, delegating and monitoring performance, and reviewing goal achievement. So actually, performance management of the team. That is what we mean here, tactician, right? So tactician is someone who is able to get his team aligned, move forward, provide them feedback, review them, all that, right? So performance management, he said, is what a tactician aspect of leadership for the first level leaders. Then he said they also have to be facilitators, right? So facilitator would mean creating an environment of collaboration and partnership to ensure effective working relationship. Right now, this actually means how can a leader, a first level leader, work along with other departments, right? And make sure that there is a kind of a teamwork that happens even among his own equals and his own peers, right? So that's the facilitator role that he needs to bring in. He can't come and say that, hey, you know what, the regional manager of that part of the country is not sharing his best practices with me, or I'm pushing the plant head to do this and they are not listening to me, or the quality team has come back with this and they are unnecessary. So those conflicts he must manage himself. So that's the facilitator role we are talking about here, right? Now, of course, this changes when you move to the next level leadership. Okay. Contributor, right? So creating organization success by contributing one's own knowledge, abilities, talent, and experience, right? So it's not about holding on to it, but about contributing, sharing with others, training others, guiding others, and so on. So, right? So that's the contributor aspect of leadership. Now, these four, visionary, tactician, facilitator, and contributor, actually translate into the next level role also, next level of leadership also, which is mid-level. Right now, at a mid-level leadership, Barrett very beautifully talks about it's no longer about today's survival. It's not about today's business. Now, this person, mid-level manager, is expected to look at growth. Right? He at mid-level, you are starting to talk about what's going to happen in the future, anticipation of challenges, right? What could be certain opportunities or certain obstacles that might come up in the near future, and thinking about also, it's not just about obstacles and opportunities, also about how do I plan the growth of my team, right? So now he's no longer looking at today's, he's talking also about tomorrow, he's talking about the next few years, right? Or the at least the next few months, if not a year or more, right? So mid-level manager are also tasked in that manner. We can say that they are moving beyond survival. They are moving towards organization growth, right? So organization growth is not just the senior leadership's job. It's also the mid-level managers' job, mid-level leaders' job to kind of make sure that um, the team is starting to think about what changes can happen in the future, right? So often I find, I also feel that your mid-level leaders can be like the glue that holds the company together, right? Because these are the guys who actually have an understanding of what the senior management, right, is thinking, and they also know what the junior level leadership is undergoing right now, right? So they are the ones who kind of bridge the gap between expectations and reality, and they are the ones who are like a communication pipeline for the organization. Now, if mid-level leaders are not equipped well, if they are not if their competencies are not mapped adequately or properly, if they are not developed on those competencies, often organizations fail because the senior management is expecting something, and the ground level reality is completely different, right? One very interesting example would be, I think, the example of Kodak, right? When we all know that, as an organization, they were very, very uh, dominating market player in uh, the camera segment, right? So, and actually, the story goes like this, that one of their managers, mid-level managers actually, he, along with a couple of interns, found out that you can replace camera rolls with a software, right? And you can capture images. Now, interestingly, that was the time when Sony was also about to come up with their digital cameras. And when they made this innovation, they went to the senior management and they said, this is going to be the future of cameras. And he gave it the word filmless camera, right? He didn't call it digital camera. That time it was just starting, I think around 1990s, mid 90s is when this happened. And he called it filmless camera. Now, very interestingly, just because he called it filmless cameras, all the directors were sitting there, what, you are taking away our own business. This is not done. And they actually shoot the idea down. And that's when, and we know the rest of the story that happens, right? Now, interestingly, this is a mid-level leadership competency, right? Of communicating well, of influencing others, to be able to see what the board or the directors don't have a sight on, right? Now, that is the mid-level leadership competencies that we are talking about. Very often undermined, but having a huge impact on the organization, right? So, what is the so again, when we look at the four aspects of leadership here, visionary. So now at mid-level leadership, what are we saying? Uh, Understanding and translating strategy and goals into work requirements and communicating vision and purpose. Like, you see the difference now between this and the earlier one. Let's just go back to the earlier, sorry. Here, what was it? It was about understanding and translating the strategy and into specific goals and targets. Now, at the mid-level manager level, leadership level, we are saying that it talks about work requirements. I'm not setting goals. I'm not setting targets, right? I'm setting a benchmark. This is where I would like our organization to be, and I'm going to communicate the vision and purpose of why we are doing this, right? I'm not going to get into dividing targets. No, you might do that as a part of your job, but that is not a competency. The competency is about inspiring teams, right? At the visionary, under the visionary aspect, this is what is expected from a mid-level leaders as per the Barrett framework. Now, of course, there are other frameworks also. So please do bear that in mind. This is just one framework that we have. Okay, at the tactician level, what happens? Tactician level, we are seeing ensuring results are achieved through effective planning, delegating responsibilities, reviewing a performance, managing budgets, and creating workflows. Now you're seeing the difference between this and the earlier one, right? So now we are saying that, you are no longer just doing a performance management. You're saying how should the processes be? What should be the processes? How will you monitor it? How will you manage budgets, right? How will you make sure costs are covered? Both revenue budgets as well as cost budgets. So everything around the P&L of the company is also now coming and sitting at a mid-level leadership level. Facilitator. Now, earlier the facilitator was about collaborating and working along with the others. Now we are saying, why don't we look at negotiation, influencing, convincing, persuading, active listening, effective communication, cultural differences, and being inclusive. Right now, this is again a very interesting aspect of a facilitator aspect of mid-level leadership. Right now, I'm no longer saying that I have to work along with others. I'm saying now I have to negotiate with them. I have to influence them. I have to convince them. So the competency itself is moving to the next level. And then, of course, contributor. Contributor, if you remember earlier in the first level leadership, we talked about just contributing knowledge, ideas, experience, and so on. But now we are saying you have to understand business issues, make decisions, understand fundamentals of business and problem solving, right? So your contribution is expected at a decision level. It is not about knowledge sharing. You can't say, मेरे हिसाब से तो ये होता था पिछले company में. No, that is not. At a mid-level leadership, you're required to connect the dots, read the patterns, analyze strengths, and recommend on sometimes even make decisions, right? So these are the four aspects at a mid-level leadership level. So I'm going to just pause here for a minute. I want to check if anybody has any questions related to this. Any questions?
Ma'am, good morning. This is Faiz, ma'am.
Yeah, good morning.
Ma'am, just one thing is, I was thinking about why are we missing the people management aspects and stability of the organization, talking about the attrition part on all levels of leadership, especially talking about the first level.
Sorry,
So,
sorry, can you just come back?
I was thinking about the one aspect of people management, right? At the first level, specifically, where we're talking about the stability of the individuals in the professions need to be on a longer horizon to take results and to move to next level. Are we missing on that aspects also on the attrition part and the people management part at the first level?
Okay. Okay. So you're saying that at a first level leadership, where is the people management coming? Is that your question?
Right, ma'am.
Yeah. So at a first level leadership, it is also about collaboration and partnership to ensure effective working relationship, right? Creating an environment of collaboration, partnership to ensure effective working relationship. So this is where it comes, and the people management also comes here in the tactician part, where you're delegating, monitoring performance, reviewing achievement. So all that happens here. So Barrett in the Barrett framework doesn't emphasize too much on inspiring teams, if motivating teams, if that's the question that you have. The framework doesn't talk too much about that. What they say, what Barrett said is that, as long as all these are happening at the first level leadership, you're good to go, right? And I think somewhere there is also an assumption that first level leaders might sometimes be focused on self leadership and not necessarily leading teams. That's also one assumption that one can read when we say, because as you can see, there is nothing much talking here about teams, whereas at a mid-level manager there is a mention of teams and looking at how you can delegate, how you can negotiate influence. So then is that something that we have to read into it. It is not specifically mentioned. But yes, what you're saying is right. That's an important aspect of the competencies of leadership, especially if you're managing a team. Okay, so moving further, we have the okay, Rebecca, I'll take your question now.
Ma'am, could you give us any example where you probably must have used this particular this particular competency, and how did you go about, any example? You can name don't name the company, that's absolutely at your end. So could you give us an example of any kind?
Yeah. I'll do that, Rebecca. I'll explain the senior level leadership, and then I'll give you an example where we actually mapped it across all the three levels for one NBFC, a non-banking finance company, and how it was mapped. I'll give you an example of that.
Sure, ma'am. Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So senior level leaders have a very significant impact over the organization, business, and multiple teams, and their primary role now moves on to the visionary level, right? So here now we are saying that you need to start thinking about the big picture. You need to start thinking about how do I create an organization culture, right? You're no longer talking about brass tacks of achieving the growth. You're not talking about achieving targets. So at a visionary level, you are actually required to think beyond the given, right? Tactician. From a tactician perspective, now we are saying that you have to set the organization goals, define roadmap, 5-year roadmap or a long-term roadmap, and identify critical roles and deliverables. So you start looking at, okay, who are the critical people in my team? How do I make sure that I have a succession plan in place? How do I make sure that people are having an understanding of the roadmap that the organization is going to be having for the next few years, right? And at a facilitator level, you're talking about negotiation, active listening, presenting to multiple groups and providing thought leadership, right? So it's no longer about uh, influencing on one particular decision. You are actually getting people to start thinking beyond the given, right? And at a contributor level, you're saying that you have to take strategic decisions which have long-term impact and developing people for the next line of leadership. Now, these are at a senior level leadership. Okay. To kind of give all of you an example, we had worked very closely with an NBFC, and they had this leadership competency framework, which was very archaic, as in they had made it about a decade back or perhaps even more. And they were continuing to use that for SSF leadership potential in their company. So what we did was we actually administered a questionnaire to all the people all the managers, right? So anybody who is managing a team and has got a certain performance rating, right? So we looked at past 3 years performance rating, and we said minimum the person should have spent 3 years in the organization, because we want to capture the culture of the organization, right? Anybody less than 3 years, they wouldn't, it would be just a one-off thing that you have a 5-on-5 rating. So we said no, we want 3 years. So anybody who has got a 5-on-5 for the past 3 years, right, and minimum cutoff is 3 years, right? So if they have 5-on-5 for 3 years or more, was qualified to take part in this study. And they were close to, I think, about 200 250 people who participated in this exercise, and all of them were administered a questionnaire in which they had to put down uh, uh, aspects of leadership which were asked through a certain multiple choice questions, which were like situational judgments based on the common situations that come up in that organization, and certain essay type questions, right? So we had asked questions like, okay, cite the biggest achievement in the past 6 months, or cite a time when your team was undergoing a major change and what was your contribution, or cite a time when you made a very strong recommendation about a business to your functional manager. Or so like this, there were some questions that were given to them. It was like, I think about 15-20 questions were there. Some also included situational questions, like I said. And then their answers were reviewed. We chose out of 250, we chose about 50 people with whom we wanted to have deeper discussions. There were focused group discussions that were done in batches of 5 or 6 people, where the agenda was clearly about discussing amongst them. We facilitated those focus group discussions. They were asked to discuss and identify what they see as leadership avatars in their company, right? So you had to identify who amongst the people in the organization they consider to be a great leader, a great manager, why, and so on and so forth. And all of them. So it was a very intense discussion for about an hour and a half with every group of 5-6 people. So we ran some 6 batches, 5 or 6 batches like that. And from that and the questionnaire, we actually pulled out data and said, okay, these are the common patterns that seem to be emerging. People are saying that communication is really important for leadership. So, but what does communication mean here? We realized that in that organization, communication was about navigation, right? It was not about influencing as much as it was about navigating with different stakeholders, right? So when we got into the deeper nuances of navigation, we actually mapped it into visionary, tactician, facilitator. And so what would you do as a visionary when it comes to navigating stakeholders, right? So you start looking at who are the other stakeholders who are involved in the business. At tactician level, you actually involve them, inform them about the different decisions you're taking. At a facilitator level, so we used this framework and mapped it to the competencies and then arrived at a holistic framework. It was a pretty interesting, and I think the exercise went on for about 3 months or 2 to 3 months. They're still using this framework, and the competencies had, there were some six, if I remember right, 6 or 7 competencies that were defined, which had aspects of navigation, empathy, uh, uh, achievement. Then it was about innovation. It was about, I don't remember the other two. So it kind of yeah, innovation, and I think it was also about setting structures and systems for the organization. So like this, there were some 6 competencies that were there, and each of them had been defined across 4 levels in the organization: junior level, mid level, senior level, and top leadership. So they said, we want to look at 4 levels because it was a pretty layered structure. Within each one also, they had multiple designations and grades. So we wanted to make sure that there was enough scope for people to exhibit competences to move from one level to the next. So that is the example that I have for using Barrett's framework for leadership competencies.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. Any further questions from anyone? Okay, Aruna, you have a question, is it?
Yeah, yes, ma'am. Ma'am, in the similar lines as you were talking about, the exercise that you have done in one of the organizations in terms of, leadership competencies. My question is that when we, it's more from academic knowledge perspective. When we look at succession planning, say I'm looking at a metric, a talent management metric, which talks about identifying the potential top performers, and I mean, across various departments, and then what you call, I would say, promoting them. No, I'm not exactly the word promoting, but then encouraging them, or they're, say, the prospective people for the leadership roles. And that's how the succession planning works, right? So my question is, can you kindly let us know, how, if you look at a process or a stepwise, how exactly does this succession planning works, ma'am? I mean, how do we really start? What is the first step, and how do we go about it?
So the first step in, I mean, although it is not related to this, but
Sorry, ma'am.
since
Yeah,
you have asked, I will just take a
okay,
few
ma'am.
minutes.
If it unnecessarily takes the time, maybe I can,
Okay, so let's do a quick check here. Would others be keen on an answer for this question, or should we take it up later? If we can quickly have a hands up here, so we can know if I should take up this question or not. Otherwise, I can of course have a discussion with Aruna later. Okay, 2 participants have raised their hand.
Ma'am, there is no harm in learning extra.
Okay. So okay, so then I'll just quickly spend I think a couple of minutes here, and then we will move further into the next step. So succession planning, the first step of succession planning is to identify the critical positions for which you are doing the succession planning. That's the first step, right? So we can't be doing succession planning for only senior roles, for example. Similarly, you can't be doing succession planning for only mid-level roles, right? Succession planning should be done for critical positions in the organization. Now, how do we identify critical position is again a separate exercise in itself. There are again factors that we consider. I'm not going to get into that, so I can start by saying that you start with critical positions. Then you map out the competencies required for those critical positions, right? So competencies can be your leadership, behavioral, technical, or you can go with organizational. Right? Some companies do organizational and technical. Some companies say, no, I want to do leadership, behavioral and technical. Some companies will say, no, I'll do only leadership and technical. That depends on, I think the reason why they kind of have this permutation combination is depending on which industry the company is in, right? Now, if it is more of a service oriented industry, then they go with organizational and technical. But if it is a manufacturing company with very scientific methodologies being applied in the factories and all, then they go with technical and behavioral and leadership also. So I kind of leave that to you to decide which, I don't know which industry you're talking about, so I'm going to leave that open. So you start with critical positions, then go into identifying competencies required for those positions. Then what you do is usually there is a two-way process that is done. One is you set certain qualifying criteria for people who will be evaluated or assessed for these critical positions, right? So usually organizations have a vintage of at least 3 years in the company. They set certain performance criteria saying performance appraisal score should be so much and above. And or they ask for a 360 feedback report if that is already there. And in the 360, there should be this much score and above. So you can set any kind of criteria. And so that's the one approach where you define who will be part of your set. And then the second part is you actually invite nominations, right? So you invite nominations from the manager and the person themselves. As long as they meet these criteria, you say that, you could nominate yourself, or you could, the manager can nominate you. The reason why we ask for nominations is that we want to make sure that people are equally invested in these efforts. It's not a thrust upon thing for someone. It's an actually they invite themselves to the process, right? So that's the third step, which is about qualifying criteria and nominations. And then the fourth is actually conducting an assessment. So we will, of course, in the next few sessions, we'll be talking about how to run an assessment development center. Then once you have those reports, there are gaps that are identified. So gaps can be based on individual development plans that are designed, or it could be group development plans that are designed, and then you identify gaps, and then you enroll them into those specific training programs. And some companies also use coaching, mentoring, job shadowing, projects, cross-functional team projects. There's so many varied ways of development or role change. They do in any or all of these in some combination, and there is a post development plan assessment. So usually a development plan for critical positions as a thumb rule is at least 2 years, right? You don't expect people to suddenly change in 1 year and be ready to take on that role. So usually it is a 2-year development intervention that is done, and post that there is one more toll gate assessment that is done, and then they are moved into that role. So you can keep at a broad level, you can keep 3 years for one end-to-end cycle of succession planning, right? From the time you identify that you need someone to the time you're able to fill that position. So you need to have at least 3 years. So this is how it is done. In some companies, they fast track the succession plan and say that, I'm going to develop only people who have a very small gap. So they have a very strong pipeline, right? So when you have a strong pipeline, then you can reduce it and say that, the gap between the position requirement and this person is only very little. So I can bridge this gap in the next 6 months to 1 year, and then hence I will move it. But those are very evolved organizations which have very strong succession planning programs, talent management programs in place, right? So succession planning happens usually in organization where there is a very strong talent management uh, practices or performance management practices in place. Without these two, getting into succession planning is usually very, very tough. Takes humongous efforts to do that. I hope I have answered your question in a nutshell.
Thank you so much, man. It's really clear. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Okay. Um, okay. So we're going to move on to the second leadership competency framework, which is the Rubin's leadership competency framework. Now, Rubin identified 5 major areas of focus in his leadership competency framework. Did anybody raise their hand just now? I'm not sure. Okay. Were there any questions? I saw 2 hands raised. I'm not sure who raised their hand, but
Ma'am, it's me. I was okay with the question being answered, Varuna's.
oh,
Thanks.
okay, for that. Okay.
Even me too, ma'am.
Okay. 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 Thank you. Thank you. So I was not sure whether who has raised the hand. Okay. Great. Thanks for answering that. Okay. We're going to move into the Rubin's leadership competency framework. Now, like I said, there are so many competency frameworks, especially leadership competency frameworks, right? There are so many of them, and every day they come up with more, right? So, I mean, if you open HBR or any of these magazines, MIT Sloan and Review, you will always find some very beautiful frameworks that they come up with. So of course, one can go and use those frameworks to map out competencies in your organization. These are just a few handful which are quite applicable in the Indian environment, and hence we are introducing these as part of the syllabus. So Rubin identified 5 major areas of focus in his leadership, right? So he said that there are analytical competencies, personal competencies, organizational, positional, and communication, right? So, so that any leadership framework should be having all of these, right? So, analytical, the way it's also you can also look at it is that something which is got to do with the head, the 3H rule, right? Head, heart, and hands, right? So he kind of mapped it in a similar fashion as head, heart, and hands, the 3H rule. So, I mean, these are analytical competencies belong to the head. Positional competencies also belong to the head, communication to the heart, and organization and personal competencies to the hand. That is the way I look at it. Of course, you can also look at it in this way or some other way, but it's easier to remember that way. So the 3H rule, right? So I mean, that's another thing that I would like to point out to all of you, that when you are mapping leadership competencies, it's important to remember the 3H rule, the head, heart, and the hands rule, because one without the other, overemphasis on one without talking about the other, can create a challenge, right? So sometimes, the execution related competencies are not talked to so much in the leadership competency framework, but that often creates a challenge when you are assessing people, because then you have people who uh, who are amazing at innovation, who are amazing at coming up with strategic ideas, but lose sight of the ground reality because they are not competent in execution, right? So execution excellence is an equally important competency, right? So the head, heart, and the hand rule, which is what I use typically, you can think of that. Now, it's not something that I have come up with. Let me clarify that. It's a beautiful concept from Germany, right? And forgetting the name of the person, It's actually an anthropological concept that is there, and often used to help even children to learn at a basic level, right? So uh, I don't want to digress from the subject. So let's look at the 3H rule also when we are defining leadership competencies.
Ma'am, can you repeat the sequence once again?
Of sequence of
I mean, head, heart, and hand on these five competences.
okay. So analytical competencies come in the head because these are cognitive by nature, right? So all the processing, decisioning competencies are all the head, right? Heart is when you are okay. Even the positional competencies. Positional competencies here primarily talk about my experience, my knowledge, and all. So that also comes in the head. Communication is where the heart is, right? So basically, how do you connect with others, right? So heart is about connecting, right? So how do you connect with others? And the hands are all about doing, right? Execution. So your personal and organizational competencies come into hand. So the 3H rule is what I call it. Uh, Even if you go back and look at your Barrett's framework, you will find the 3H rule coming out there, right? So you'll have the visionary, you will have the tactician, then you have sorry, I'm forgetting now. Yeah, facilitator and contributor, right? So visionary is the head, tactician is somewhere between the head and the hands, facilitator is definitely the heart, and contributor is definitely the hand, right? So that's the way I look at it, but this is just my own personal thumb rule when I'm deciding or designing competency frameworks, especially leadership level, because the tendency is to move towards either the head too much or to the heart, talking too much about communication. You don't focus on execution at all. Okay. Okay, we're going to go into analytical competencies of Rubin. Right. So he says that you have to be reflective, self-aware, thoughtful, attentive to one's own and others' feelings. Analytical competencies also include clarifying situations and problems, assessing stakeholders and systems issues, right? Considering and selecting among alternative strategies, and factoring in relevant data and historical accounts, and planning and implementing strategies and evaluating outcome, right? So analytical competencies, according to Rubin, was all about strategic planning, problem solving, and data analysis, right? So those are the analytical leadership competencies that he talked about. Then you have the personal competencies. So personal competencies, he talks about displaying character, ethics, personal values, and enthusiasm, holding high standards, conviction, and persistence, and maintaining and exhibiting self-discipline, self-confidence, and showing high tolerance for uncertainty and ambiguity, right? He also talked about engaging in calculated risk-taking and admiring and being perceived as role models by others, right? So some bit of inspiration, some bit of commitment, some bit of change management, um, and result orientation is what he talks about when he talks about personal competencies, right? So he says that these have got nothing to do with the team. Irrespective of the team that might be with you, you should be able to display these competencies if you are in a leadership role, right? So these are personal competencies. And then you have the organizational competencies, which are to do more with the organization that you're leading. So vision setting, strategy development, and execution. Information and knowledge management and collaboration. Coaching and teaching of team members, change and crisis management, empowering the teams and providing support, facilitating and engaging in successful negotiations. So he says that for a leader to survive well in an organization, these are the competencies that they must display. One of the things that keeps, I think, Rubin's framework a little apart from others is he says that leadership is a lot to do with how do you manage change and how do you ensure that your team is equipped to adapt to change, right? And that's really important in his framework in terms of competencies, right? So whereas Barrett's framework, there is only one aspect of change. Here you have multiple references to managing change. Then we have positional competencies. Positional competencies, like I said before, are more to do with your past experience and background. So this includes subject matter knowledge, skills which are deemed necessary for effective leadership within a specified field, such as business, healthcare, sports, politics, etc. These are context, job, or sector-specific educational training, background experiences, job familiarity, organizational understanding, and professional development are also included in these positional competencies. It also includes technical language or vocabulary needed for the job role. So these, we must kind of think of these as thought leadership or SME kind of technical competencies when it comes from a leadership angle. So not to be confused with technical competencies as such, but to understand that at a leadership level, let me give you an example here. There is a healthcare company where I am consulting, and they said we want to hire a country head for our company. So can you map out the competencies that are required from a leadership angle? So one of the competencies that we did put out very clearly was to be able to provide thought leadership about that particular segment based on experience of managing change, right? So it was a very interesting and a very different competency, primarily because you are merging three things there. You're talking about thought leadership, you're talking about change management, and you're talking about providing guidance and leadership to others, right? So three things were clubbed into one particular statement, and that kind of helped us in sifting through many CVs, because some people have thought leadership but haven't managed change. Some people could have done other two but have never guided others, and so on and so forth, right? So I'm sure you understand the gist of what I'm saying. So positional competencies are to do more with the requirement to be successful in that role. What kind of specific industry related or knowledge related leadership connected competencies do I need to bring to the table? So these are positional competencies. Move on to communication competencies. Like I said, these are heart. That's how I relate to it. So knowledge and skills required for effective interaction in interpersonal, group, organization, and public setting, message sending and message reception in varying contexts with varying individuals and groups, specific communication dimensions, including establishing credibility and trust, persuasion, interpersonal relations, and team building, listening, questioning, writing, speaking, diversity and intercultural relations, facilitating, negotiating, and conflict resolution. Now, these are very important communication competencies. And if you remember, I just spoke about how in Rubin's framework, there's a lot of mention about managing change, right? So here also you can see this about message reception and sending in varying contexts, varying individuals, like, so there is an attribution to change. Then conflict resolution, right? Now this was, you didn't find a mention of this in the Barrett's framework, but in the Rubin's framework, you talk about conflict resolution and negotiation. And of course, diversity and intercultural relation. And one very important aspect that he brings in is about establishing credibility and trust, right? So bringing an authenticity into our communication, making sure there is trust in the organization, right? So these are the communication competencies that he talks about. So how would you use it in a when you design competencies, right? So what I would do if I were you is when I am designing competencies or articulating leadership competencies for my organization, I would say that, okay, do I have analytical competencies or not? Do I have positional competencies or not? Do I have organizational competencies or not? Do I have communication competencies or not? So I look at all the 5 dimensions and make sure that I have covered it. And have I left out or by mistake missed any aspect of these competencies? Right? So that's the way I would look at it. Now, of course, you can go back and say, I'm going to have definitely one communication or definitely one organization or definitely one position. I leave that to you. It's how you use the framework. End of the day, it's just a framework and a way of thinking, right? Frameworks just provide us those models on how we can think about leadership. Which leadership competencies you want to use or which ones you want to bring out as most important depends on the organization and the business context and your own ability to map them out. Okay, I'm going to take a pause now here for a minute or two. I want to check if there are any questions. Yeah, go
Ma'am,
ahead.
can you bring back the slide of first one, analytical competences?
Yeah, go ahead, Fez.
Ma'am, I was asking, you said all 5s are important and depends on the organizational and the environment, right? In my own experience or in my organization, what I have seen, the people, if you talk about the positional experience, the people don't have the industry experience, right? Then also they brought people from other industries to particular industry. So is that, if you talk about the 5 dimension, is the positional or that dimension is need to be given more specific weightage? Is that something happen to industry wise or depends on the whole company policies?
So I've seen many companies bringing
I've
in
seen
this.
I've seen he been successful leader, right? Just to bring about that mode.
So I think that's the reason why competencies are important, and one might have an industry agnostic policy, right? I know a couple of organizations which say that. In fact, very interestingly, there was I remember this way back in 2010 or 2010 or 11, we ran a very interesting leadership program for Edelweiss for their wealth management team called the Private Banker Program. And there, one of the things which we recommended, and Edelweiss being a very forward-looking company had accepted also. And I remember the head of wealth management, he said that, yes, I agree with you that we should have an industry agnostic policy. So we actually hired people from diverse industries like healthcare, executive search, hospitality, and so on, and brought them into the company to take on leadership positions in wealth management. I mean, wealth management is as technical as it can get with respect to finance, and we actually brought in people from medical, right, medical equipment sector, and they did excellently well. There were people from executive search who did excellently well. So I think it depends a lot on the organization's policy. But what this one also, Rubin also talks about, from if you look at the positional competencies, he talks about background experience and organizational understanding and professional development, right? Now, some of these competencies can actually be trained, right? It's not necessary that these have to be qualifying criteria to do exceptionally well in the role. You can actually train people or develop people to build these competencies in them. So we spent close to about 6 months putting them through an immersion, but they came out extremely successful and they're doing very well in the wealth management space. So in a sense, what you say is right. It depends on organizational context, but I also feel that to be able to do well, if you don't have these competencies, it's to an extent it becomes a disadvantage for you from a leadership angle, So you need to, even if you're coming from other industries, you need to kind of pick up this over a period of time. So while you might not be there yet, you will need to be there in order to be successful, right? You can't always say that, I don't know this terminology or I don't know this subject and stay away from it. It's like going into and working into an IT company and say, hey, I don't know anything about technology. How long will you be able to be successful, right? After some time, you need to understand technology and you need to bring in that edge in you in order to be successful in the tech company. So like that, I think, I hope I have answered your question.
Yeah. Just to add on, with your own experience being in the veteran in the industry, do you find, this strategy works well with diverse people bringing from other industry, being successful leaders? What's your take on that?
So I think it's about the the culture of the organization, the I think mindset of the leadership team that drives the success of such strategies. So here, actually, the one of the biggest challenges was that the compensation was the reason why they said, we need to have industry agnostic, because if you went and hired somebody from wealth management space, it would have been very expensive, right? So we had to give like a 30%, 40% increment. And then when we did a back end, back of the envelope ROI calculations, we saw that, we actually end up making a lot more if we hire people and spend 6 months training them with no productivity and then check, then also we were making more money. Even if we, put in like say 50% attrition, assuming that, 50% of the people whom we take in don't want to stay on because they don't like it. We had put in all these calculations and then made a recommendation and it worked. But I also know of certain companies where it didn't work, primarily because there was a mindset that, ये experiment करके देखते हैं, चला तो चला, नहीं चला तो नहीं चला. When you start with that kind of a mindset, then 99.9% of the time I feel it doesn't work, because there is no investment of energy and effort, right? So it's always like a no, yeah, I mean, if it works, it works. If it doesn't work, then nobody's lost anything. So when you don't lose anything, you don't invest much also, right? So you leave it on somebody else to drive it, and over a period of time you realize that it hasn't fetched you the kind of results that you want. So in those companies this doesn't work. So there has to be a strong buy-in of the senior management, and there has to be the culture which is inclusive, where people don't look down on you because you are from a different industry, where people, I really respect your background. And third, very importantly, the culture of the organization should be open to such things. So
Yeah, what I find, because in my organizations, I was into healthcare, right? So they bought a people, the guy who's a CFO of Tata Sky, right? So health care and a Tata Sky is two totally different industries, backgrounds. But he bought certain innovation changes in the way of dynamics the healthcare sector works. But really click in 2 years, he brought a change of around 30-40% increase and bring back the energy to the whole organization. So my experience. So that might help in another way also.
So yeah, so see, I mean, it has worked, right? So I think there could be, it's a beautiful case study, and you should try and understand, what helped in making it work. So one is, the acumen of the person, right? So that's the leadership competence, to
Right.
be able to bring in the right best practices. I can't, like I've seen, many in fact, just a few weeks back, I was talking to a person with a very big IT company, and he had joined them recently from Infosys. Okay. And I think 80% or 90% of the time, like I spent close to about 2 hours talking to them about some of the challenges they were facing. 80 to 90% of the time, he kept saying, we did this, we did that. And I kept thinking that he's talking about his current company. But towards the end of the conversation, I realized that he kept referring to we as emphasis.
Right.
So then I know for a fact that it's going to be very tough for this person to get into this culture, because he still associates himself so strongly with his earlier organization. So I wouldn't be surprised if he moves out in the next few months or a year at the very max. So I think it's also, that's why it's the competency, right? Some people are able to translate it so beautifully. Some people find it very tough to define what can be brought in and what should be left there. That I think is very interesting to observe and to assess when we are hiring people at that level, right? I mean, they should not come back into the बहुत बार ये होता है that they'll say that हमारे कंपनी में तो ऐसा होता था, हम लोग तो ऐसे करते थे, we used to do this, यहाँ पे ऐसा नहीं होता है. So I mean, yeah, you used to do it, but the fact is you're here, and either you bring it here and drive it here, or you don't talk about it. There's no point going back and referring to it. References help the first 3 months. Beyond that, references help only if it is converted into execution. So I think that is very important for these kind of competencies.
Right, ma'am. Thanks. Probably I've taken so much of time.
Oh, no problem, no problem. Any other? I saw a couple of more hands. Yes, Kinshuk Sinha.
Very good morning, ma'am.
Good morning.
I mean, coming back to the original discussion of Rubens and the barrels, right? I was simply wondering, if I look at it very keenly, I mean, most of the points are intermingled in both of them, right? And it is the leader's prerogative to use any of them.
Yeah.
Whether it be one line from there or one line from here.
Yeah.
I was wondering then, I mean, when these were basic, I mean, Rubens and if you could time it, like when was it timed?
See, these are not in terms of sequencing, it's not as if one built over the other. And that's the reason why we didn't want to mention time, because you should not think that this is an evolution of a leadership framework.
Okay.
So they were all done around. See, if you look at most of the leadership frameworks that are there in this world, right, they have started around 70s and late 60s, 70s.
You did mention Drucker. Drucker is father of management as such. That is 1940s or 50s. So if I take that as a basic skeleton of everything, so Peter Drucker is the Bible.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, it is as such that when I time it like that, इसके बाद ये आया, इसके बाद ये आया. So every other thinker or person might have built on the previous one.
Not necessarily, and because a lot of them actually have also evolved in different spaces of industry, different universities, different research studies have been done. So while, I mean, because this is not a program on, I mean, this is not a syllabus on leadership development as such, we are using only leadership competencies to help you define leadership competencies for your own company. We are not getting into models of leadership as such. So we just picked up 3 frameworks which will be useful for you to articulate and use leadership competencies from an Indian perspective. That's all that we have tried to cover in this syllabus.
Okay.
It's not a leadership development subject.
Yeah,
so,
I agree. It just came into my mind if times could be great.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. We did all this. So we're going to go on to the third leadership competency framework, which is the pyramid structure. Now, this is like the iceberg theory of leadership, right? So similar to that, but no, a slightly different framework that is used. So here we talked about level 1, level 2, and level 3. So in this pyramid leadership framework, what they say is, this is actually fairly recent by nature. I mean, now that because he's asked, this actually was developed only around the 1990s. Right? So this is one of the most recent leadership competency frameworks that is available. Okay. So here we talk about professional competencies, leadership competencies, and core competencies, right? So in professional competencies, we talk about instructional design, adult learning, instruction design, rapid design, consulting, and instructions. So it's all about how do I bring in change? How do I make sure people understand what is change? How do I make sure that teams around me learn and move faster? How do I consult with other departments? Very often, leadership is not seen as one of the biggest competencies that is there of leadership, but which is often understated is the role of as a consulting person, right? Consulting competencies. So what do I mean by consulting competencies is to be able to advise and guide other departments or other units, right? So that's the consulting role, right? So you actually come in as an expert and talk about how it can really how you can help other departments, other stakeholders, right? And then instructions, right? So these are the 5 areas that these professional competencies talk about, where you look at different aspects of at level 1 of the pyramid, right? At a level 2, you're actually looking at other aspects like leadership abilities, visioning, creating and leading teams, assessing situations quickly and accurately, fostering conflict resolution, project management, implement employee involvement strategies, coach and train peers and subordinates. So these are the aspects of leadership competencies at level 2. And at level 3, he talks about communicating, teamwork, creative problem solving, interpersonal skills, manage client relationships, self-direction, right? That's also a very interesting leadership competency. Flexibility, professionalism, financial and business acumen. So these are the competencies that are there at level 3, right? So when we go into core competencies, what the way one could look at it is for my leadership team, right? So for a say a junior level leadership team, which amongst these do I want to pick and how do I want to define it for them? So that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that have I covered any aspects of core competencies when I'm defining the leadership framework for my organization, right? So when we say core competencies here, it also means that from a leadership angle, if any or some of these competencies are not there, perhaps we are missing out on very essential or important aspects of leadership. So that's the mindset with which this particular framework has been made, right? And one of the aspects here, which is about client relationship management or financial knowledge, these also come from the fact that clients can also be both internal and external clients, not necessarily only external clients. So one can also read it as stakeholder management. And with respect to financial knowledge, it can also be translated as commercial acumen, right? So how much am I able to bring in my understanding of the business, understanding of ROIs, understanding of budgets, costing, etc., into my leadership competencies. So that could be one way of looking at it. Okay, so these are the core competencies that he talks about. And then you have leadership competencies. Here he's talking about vision, creating and leading teams, assessing situations quickly and accurately, conflict resolution, project management, implementing employee involvement or engagement strategies, and coaching and training. So these are, so when we say leadership abilities here, it also means that, are we able to lead the team towards achieving results or excellence in execution, right? So those are the ways we interpret this pyramid model. And And then you have professional competencies. Professional competencies, essentially, although you use the see the words here, sorry, you see the words here of adult learning, instruction design, consulting, and instructions. What he is also trying to say is that, are you looking at coaching people? Are you looking at making sure that the processes that have been designed are easy to understand and translate with respect to the teams? How do you make sure that you consult with other departments and make sure that you guide and instruct people well? So that is the way they are looked at it. Pyramid competency framework is not used very often, but it's useful to know this because you make sure then that you cover at least one or two aspects of each level of the pyramid. Okay, so
ma'am, I have a question, please.
Yeah.
Ma'am, when we talk about these professional competencies or core competencies, considering under the leadership competency framework, all of these or any of these will fall under technical competency in some or the other way for other positions, do they? Or they're purely,
no, so this can form under technical also. You're right. These sometimes, like for example, if you have a say a finance team, then you might want to have financial acumen or business acumen or one of these as part of technical also. I'm honestly not a very big fan of the pyramid framework. It's actually just like a very rudimentary leadership framework that is there. But I have found that a lot of consulting companies using this pyramid framework to help in defining what competencies are used, leadership competencies are used in the organization, and hence we thought we should introduce it here. Similarly, client relationship management, often it is translated very literally to say, external clients. It can also be internal clients. So there are a lot of nuances that one needs to understand when we are using the pyramid structure.
Thank you.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of this session. Any questions? Okay, so since we don't have any questions, yeah, Yogesh, go ahead. You're on mute.
Ma'am, I have this one query. So like if I understand the job description, this talks more about the competencies, indirectly about the required skills that is in for the job. I have come across some organizations who are well established. When they describe the format of job application, it is something very different, or maybe it is specific, like you narrated in this conversation also for an IT industry, it is specific to the IT one. But then if there are newcomers, how do they articulate or how do they percolate those required competencies which are not in the language terms to be understood by the normal or the first time applicant?
Sorry, I didn't understand. How do the newcomers
get to understand the required skill or the competency that the organization is specifying in the job description, which is like, so I'm coming from the world of the Accenture, Facebook or Amazon or the HCL and the world of evolved companies. And I still see the newcomers getting the better opportunities. But then there is a section, so in that case, me also, I have not been able to apply on those places for some reason or the other, because I found maybe those application method or the required skills that they are asking is something which is really new to me or alien to me.
So, so is your question about how do I understand what are the competencies required for new company?
Yes.
I mean, for companies which you don't know anything about. Is that the question?
Yeah. Yes.
Before joining the company. Before joining the company.
Yeah. Yes.
So, see, most of the times, like the companies that you mentioned, like say Facebook or Microsoft or Apple or any of these with very strong HR practices, people practices usually define these competencies in the job description quite beautifully. and they talk about what it means to be practicing that competency in that organization. But if that is not clearly defined, then I would suggest that the best thing to do is to try and reach out to some people in who are working in that organization and understand what it means and how do they kind of practice that competency, and also what would that mean in terms of the questions that will be asked or the expectations during the interview. So I think that kind of background work we have to do when we are applying for these companies. But once you have joined, I think life becomes much more easier, because they usually have a lot of material that is available, which you can enroll for, read, learn, and apply.
Sure, ma'am. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, Aruna, you have question?
Yeah, I'm sorry, ma'am. I have a lot of questions, but I thought it's always good to get them clarified.
Yeah, please go ahead.
As what Yogesh said, I don't know, somewhat similar question. Now he's talking about such big companies like Amazon and Accenture and all, where you expect all the competencies to be well defined and all. Now I was as I said, when I was preparing this document, also a lot of thoughts were entering my mind. When we look at the entry level candidate, we definitely will not look at competencies as such, right? We will only look at the knowledge part. How much knowledge he has pertaining to that particular job. I mean, if he's a fresher, because we are directly
actually, why not? You should look for certain behavioral competencies, right? And let me give you a very good example. Like a person whom I will hire for SBI, for example, State Bank of India, might not be a great hire, even if he has the same IQ in, say, a multinational bank, even if it is a fresher. So I remember the time when, for Yes Bank, not recently, about 5 years back, when we used to run game-based assessments to help them identify specific competencies for hiring campus graduates. Right. So they were very specific areas that we used to look at when hiring. Even now, when you go for campus hiring also, most companies have a set of competencies that they look for, right? Some companies will look for individuals who thrive by themselves, independent contributors, right? Whereas some companies will say, no, I want team players. Some companies will say, I want creative, imaginative person. Some companies will say, no, I want analytical, logical people. Some companies will say, I want people who can manage ambiguity. Some people will say, no, I want somebody who will adhere to processes. Some companies will say, I want somebody who is confident speaker. Some companies will say, no, I want somebody who will, should be able to work alone, right? There should not be too much of an extrovert, because I don't have that kind of a job where he has to mingle with others. He should be able to sit alone and work for hours, and he has to just do coding. So competences will be different, no? Even though the knowledge IQ might be the same, the competencies you might want from these fresh graduates will be very different.
Ma'am, in continuation of the same question, even if we look at people, when we recruit at different roles, I have seen, I'm talking about 15, 16 years back, working with some very good corporates, and at the same time, I would say, budding KPOs, where I observed, when I'm interviewing, say, a hub lead for a KPO, what happens is, basically we just look at more from job description perspective than actually concentrating on the competencies. Okay, this guy has done this, so let me evaluate him on those bases. So I feel JD becomes it takes over the competencies. Is my feeling, ma'am.
So what you must do, Aruna, is that apart from the JD, there should be a competency questionnaire that one must make, right? So if you're clear on what competencies you're assessing for, there must be an interview evaluation form or a questionnaire which defines very specifically these 10 questions you need to ask. And the interviewer has to answer their inferences based on those 10 questions. So then you start evaluating not just for JD, and I'm just saying 10, you can have 5 or 3 or 4 also, I'm just saying 10. So people start evaluating for competencies also. And one of the things that we also do is when we are rolling out these competencies and integrating it into the recruitment process, we run an awareness session where people are actually made to understand A, what these competencies are, B, why are they important, and C, how you must evaluate them in an interview. What kind of questions you can ask. Otherwise, the fundamental question everyone is, what are your strengths? Oh, I'm a very hardworking person. So what, if you're hardworking? Everybody is hardworking. Now you tell me what you bring to the table. No, I bring a lot of hard work to the table. Because very tough, na? But if you have some specific competency question saying that, tell me a time when you felt that you managed change very well. Because I'm evaluating a change management company, then that guy will say, okay, I did this. So then we understand, okay, was he able to visualize change, or did he just adapt to change, or did he just struggle to go along with change, or what did you do in that change? So then you can identify whether that competency is there or not, right? So it's important to have like one lexicon of a set of questions which every interviewer must ask, and the interviewer's comments must be written, and then based on that only an offer letter will be rolled out. Without that, I will not roll out on. So some policy like that is really important. Otherwise, you will end up hiring people only based on JD.
Thank you so much, man. That's really a good answer to know. Yeah, as you said, the probing questions and all, a separate questionnaire, and making the team also aware, how important the competencies are. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Great. So on that note, we will close the session today. So have a great weekend, or whatever is left of it, and a great week ahead. I'm going to see you next week again. All the best.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so very much, ma'am.